I don't see your screen, Kelly. Oh, there
I
I
see
do.
it.
Okay.
I see it.
We all seen the screen.
I see
Okay.
I see Kelly's screen. Yeah.
Okay, this is great. All right. Well, welcome to the May 2026 meeting of the Houston Archaeological Society. My name's Bob Sewell, and I'm the president of the society. I'm pleased to welcome our speaker this evening, Dr. Kelly Jenks, PhD, who is Associate Professor and Museum Director in the Department of Anthropology at the New Mexico State University in Las Cruces, New Mexico. Kelly will discuss a Spanish colonial settlement in Tijeras Canyon, New Mexico. I hope I said that right.
You
I
did.
did. Okay, my Spanish isn't normally good. In 1763, New Mexico's Spanish colonial governor granted land in a dangerous mountain pass to a group of families desperate for property. These families were expected to build a fortified settlement and defend it in exchange for the right to hold the acreage. 7 years later, their homesteads were attacked, and the traumatized survivors retreated to Albuquerque, refusing to return even though that meant forfeiting their land. This talk draws on archaeological and historical evidence to tell the story of the people who settled here and what their lives were like during their short time in the landscape. Dr. Jenks specializes in historical archaeology and heritage management, with a particular interest in the relationships between everyday objects and cultural identity. Most of her archaeological research focuses on Spanish land grant communities in New Mexico, including San Miguel de Vado and Cañon de Carnu.
Conway.
Conway, okay. She also has many years of experience working in cultural resource management and currently serves as vice chair of the state of New Mexico's Cultural Properties Review Committee. Please welcome Dr. Kelly Jenks. All yours, Kelly.
Thank you. You must have improved on that. I don't remember writing that. Thank you so much for the introduction and the invitation to come talk to you guys today. As the introduction says, what I thought I would talk to you guys about is some of the research that I've been doing at Cañon de Carnoy, specifically this work on the site of San Miguel. So I'm going to start as clearly as I can with sort of a beginning of where and when are we talking about. So we are talking about a site that is occupied within the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which covered pretty much all of Spanish claim territory within North America and was governed by a viceroyal appointed by the Spanish crown. Within, and that's basically all of the area on this map on the left that's shown in blue here. Within that, we're specifically within the Colonial province of New Mexico, which is where this arrow is pointing right here. New Mexico, you of course have some earlier colonial exploration, the Cabeza de Vaca expedition, or well, wanderings of the 1530s, the Coronado expedition of 1540 to 1542, which is actually camped out in New Mexico for most of that time. But you don't actually have the establishment of a formal colony of New Mexico until 1598. That initial colony, sort of that early colonial period, ends with the Pueblo uprising and revolt of 1680, when the colonists are driven south out of New Mexico. And in 1692, when they come back and reestablish a colonial government in New Mexico, we enter what's called the late colonial period, late Spanish colonial period in New Mexico, which witnesses, among other things, the founding of the colonial city of Albuquerque, which is still New Mexico's largest city today. And so where I'm talking about is within the Alcaldía de Albuquerque, which means that it's governed by the Alcalde Mayor, who's based in Albuquerque, sort of the regional government official who answers to the governor of New Mexico, who in turn answers to the viceroyal. And then within this Alcaldía de Albuquerque, I'm focusing especially on the Cañón de Carnaway land grant. So that is this little green circle over here on this map on the bottom right. This is just east of the colonial city of Albuquerque. The city of Albuquerque is established on the Rio Grande. This is kind of on the other side of the mesa, right at the foothills of and in the canyon between the Sandia Mountains to the north and the Manzano Mountains to the south. And during this time, the 1760s, the colonial authorities would grant lands to groups of applicants who were desperate enough for the ability to own land that they would occupy sort of dangerous frontier zones. And in exchange for getting title to kind of lands to build their homes on and agricultural lands to farm and to graze and access to lands held in common, they were obligated to build infrastructure, build a fortified settlement around a central plaza, and to hold and defend those lands. And so for the people who settled this site in Cañón de Carnaway, what they are doing for the colonial authorities is basically holding this mountain pass, this dangerous mountain pass that puts them between all of these colonial settlements along the Rio Grande, including the community or the larger communities at Albuquerque. And on the other side of that mountain pass, you're basically moving out towards the plains. This is sort of where I-40 continues through today, into space that at that time was very much considered, as explained on this map from 1779, it was considered Comanche territory. And the Spanish colonists and the Comanches were not getting along great at this time in the 1760s. And so they were given the right to settle these lands and to own these lands, but the danger that came with that is that they had to hold this mountain pass. So this is the site. A few images here of the archaeological site. So on this photo on the left, we're actually looking west towards the Rio Grande. So these are room blocks, actually blocks of, or the sort of outlines of rooms built around the central plaza that were part of that plaza settlement in 1763. But if you kind of stood up on top of the hill right here and looked down, you could see all the way, depending on the smog, you could see all the way down to the Rio Grande and the city of Albuquerque. But if you turn around and look the other way, so this is a reconstruction of the site right here, but looking towards the east, you're looking at that canyon, what is today known as Tijeras Canyon, but at the time in the 1760s was known as the Cañón de Carnaway. And this is sort of the canyon that leads east towards the plains that they're supposed to be holding. And again, in time, we're focused on the late Spanish colonial period. They are settling this site in 1763. That's when their application, a group of heads of households submitted an application to the governor of New Mexico for the right to settle these lands, and it was approved. And so they are actually able to, the Alcaldía, the Alcalde Mayor of Albuquerque takes them out to this place to establish the site of the plaza and to sort of officially grant everybody their lands in February of 1763. They live there until they are attacked supposedly by Gileño Apaches in October of 1770. And the attack is bad enough that the survivors flee west towards Albuquerque. The colonial authorities try very hard to convince them to resettle the lands and continue to sort of hold this pass, but they won't. It's too dangerous. They're terrified to go back there. And so when they refuse to resettle, they are ordered to go with the alcalde back to their homes in May of 1771 and actually to destroy their homes so that nobody else reuses them and they forfeit their claim on the land. And then none of the colonists are living here again until 1819 when the lands are granted yet again. So that's kind of the when and where we are. So now in terms of how do we know what we know about any of these properties? In 2021 is when I started working on this project, though I was having conversations beginning in sort of 2017 about it. So in 2021, we did an archaeological survey of the site that had been associated with this land grant plaza. It's known by the very compelling name of LA 12924, which I will not say again. I'm just going to call it the San Miguel site or Carnaway. We did an archaeological survey of the entire site in 2021 with the NMSU Field School to identify all of the features, all of the room blocks, all the different components, because actually you had, even though it's a pretty small site, you had several different occupations ranging from kind of the 12th century to the 20th century contained within this site. The most substantial components were a historic Pueblo room block, which you see kind of here in the south, which was occupied sometime between the Coronado expedition and the Pueblo revolt, so between 1540 and 1680. And then there's a gap, and then you have this larger plaza complex to the north. So you have a series of rooms organized around an open plaza space. And that is the site of the San Miguel Plaza settlement. That was the only authorized kind of settlement within the land grant that was established in 1763. And so then we went, which by the way, I realize as I'm talking to the Houston Archaeological Society, it is ironic how much the site boundary looks like Texas. Within that kind of component, that plaza component, the following year in 2022, we went back to do some excavation, some test excavation to try to get some context within some of the rooms and portions of the plaza, but also to figure out more about what was happening. All these gray shaded areas around most of the plaza are areas that had clearly been excavated before, including this big trench right here. And so we were also trying to figure out what we could learn about the site, not only sort of the people living here in the 1760s, but also what had happened with these earlier excavations, and doing some stabilization work with those as well. And one of the outcomes of that, in addition to actually helping us learn more about the site, both sort of the people living in the rooms around the plaza and that open plaza space in the middle through those test excavations, is that we were also able to track down information about that earlier excavation that covered most of the plaza, this entire south and a lot of the east side. It was actually a UNM, University of New Mexico field school. So that's our rival university in New Mexico. They excavated this site and other portions around it in a big field school that they did in 1946. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to trace any evidence of a report ever being written or any kinds of articles or student papers or anything. We haven't found any information describing the project, how it was laid out, how it was conducted, and what they learned. But what we have found are the artifacts that they recovered, the bulk artifacts that they recovered, and a handful of kind of notes and documents. So this is a photograph right here that was from a student newspaper article that was done documenting this field school class. And so I've superimposed it, the historic photograph over sort of a photograph from our field season, because you can line up the features in the background, the kind of mountains in the background, and figure out where they were actually excavating in this photograph, which is part of that same southern block of rooms. And so I've been working as creatively as possible to try to figure out what I can about where the various artifacts that they collected were coming from and how their mapping system worked in that project from 1946, because they recovered a lot of material. It's mostly same as our test excavations. It's mostly pottery and animal bone, but they did a lot more excavation than we did in 22. And they brought back many thousands of boxes of bulk artifacts that were mostly had never been processed. So we've also been working with those collections, trying to learn what we can from the artifacts, but also learn what we can about where those artifacts might have come from within the site. And these are some photographs of former students of mine presenting some of the research based on those collections, those previous collections of artifacts. Okay, so moving into the sort of who was living there and why were they living there. This gets into what it means to be living in one of these 18th century land grant communities in New Mexico. So the heads of households are described in the records. That there's not actually a surviving copy of the initial application for the land grant, but there are documents from kind of the letters confirming the grant and from the lands being distributed. And what research has been done primarily by the historian Francis Swadesh on kind of the archival records relating to that land grant that was made in 1763. The only names that are ever going to appear are the people who are listed as heads of household, because to apply for and receive a community land grant like this, you needed to bring together multiple households, the heads of whom would all kind of sign on to a letter of application. They had to be married, that was a requirement. And they would like their names would be listed in those records. And so you can take those names and try to trace them in genealogical records, baptisms, marriages, death certificates, and things within the colonial record to see how they're identified. So those heads of households that we've been able to track their names are described as Españoles, meaning Spanish colonial, but also as Genízaros and Coyotes. So these are our casta or caste terms that were used in colonial New Spain to try to classify the population in terms of their ancestry, because depending on your ancestry, you had different sort of legal rights and obligations, whether you could own property, whether you could be tried by, charged by the Spanish Inquisition, all of these things based on your ancestry. And so somebody in New Mexico, especially, this idea or this casta category, this caste identity of Genízaro, that term is really very specifically used in New Mexico to describe people who are usually are entirely indigenous, but have been raised within the Spanish colonies. So they're considered, the term that's sometimes used as like detribalized or Hispanicized Indians. Oftentimes this happened because you have a captive exchange that is part of the colonial economy. And so in trading fairs throughout the 1700s, at Taos Pueblo, at Pecos Pueblo, at Gran Quivira in sort of the previous century, you would have, among other things that might happen in these big trading fairs towards the eastern plains, like bison hides and food being traded. The colonial authorities would oftentimes bring knives for trade, but they would also be trading in people. So captives that were oftentimes taken on the plains, they could be Apache, they could be Wichita, Pawnee, Comanche, Ute, Navajo, any taken as captives from anywhere, that they would be then sometimes sold in these trading fairs to colonial families. And the idea was that you would be providing them with, baptism and Christianity, you'd be saving their souls, but in exchange, they're essentially slave labor, right? They are belong to the family who has acquired them and are living as sort of their servants. And these are primarily women and kids that are exchanged and sold as captives. So these individuals then can acquire or be granted freedom. And oftentimes, because so many of them are women, they are also having children, frequently fathered by the heads of household. Those children, though, are not legitimate. There's, no father on record, and they're being born without any status within the colonies. So they're usually going to be baptized, and they're going to learn to speak Spanish, and they live in colonial homes, but they don't own any property. And so they oftentimes, even if they do have their if they are a captive who is granted their freedom, or if they are born free, they still don't have any resources. So they're oftentimes going to continue to work as servants or household servants or as shepherds. There's the sort of partidario system is a system, economic system in New Mexico at this time that's kind of sharecropping, but with sheep, right? Where you can work tending somebody else's livestock, especially sheep and goats. And they sort of maintain ownership, but you get, if you're able to grow the herd, you get sort of a small percentage of what you were able to develop in that time. So that's kind of in the 1760s in New Mexico. People who are listed in colonial records as Genízaro, that's oftentimes who they are. They're these indigenous people of varied cultural backgrounds who've been raised or otherwise assimilated into the Spanish colonies, but who oftentimes lack resources and status. They don't own property, they don't have much wealth. And so they were especially interested in and recruited for these community grants of land that would provide them with the opportunity to actually own property and to be able to improve their lot in life, right? To be able to own their own livestock, grow their own food, and not be as beholden, so they could actually move up in the world, as it were. But to do so, it meant taking on these lands that were in really dangerous places. And so that is what this community is. It's one of these land-grant communities that's occupying a really sort of dangerous mountain pass. And so many of the people who are applying for and being granted these lands are people who are of indigenous ancestry, like these Genízaros. The Casa term coyote in this context probably means that their mother is Pueblo Indian, although that's another term that can have a few varied meanings, but it's that they're of mixed ancestry, heavily indigenous ancestry. So we know that's true just from the documents describing the people who are listed as heads of households. It doesn't describe their wives, and they did have to be married. It doesn't describe if there are any household servants. And so those are the people that we don't know as much about from colonial records that are part of why we're so interested in doing archaeological research at this site as well, is to understand what it means in the 1760s to be living in a colonial land grant settlement, like where you are a Spanish colonist, but you're also potentially of, indigenous backgrounds, varying degrees of familiarity and connection to that background, and potentially connected with many different tribes. Okay, so in addition to what we know about the heads of household, including many people of Genízaro and Coyote, Pasta identity, as well as people who are listed as Espanol, which in the context of New Mexico at that time means passing as Spanish. The other thing that we know is that a lot of the family names in the list of those heads of household were common names in the community of Bareles. So we're back to this map showing Carnaway here in this mountain pass. There's a creek called Tijeras Creek that is sort of spring fed and surface water fed that forms kind of in that mountain pass in the canyon. And then at a certain point, it actually drops underground. So it's, when you're closer to Albuquerque, it's called Tijeras Arroyo because it's just a big open arroyo, but the water is there. It's just under the sands. And it goes, eventually empties all the way down into the Rio Grande south of Albuquerque. And that same area south of Albuquerque is where the neighborhoods that are still known today as Bareles are. So it seems likely that at least some of the people who applied for and settled these lands were already living in the Albuquerque area, especially to the south. And that many of them, especially those who were listed as Genízaro or Coyote, might have also had connections to some of the local Pueblo communities, which includes Isleta, which is down here to the south. You have the Sandia Pueblo community is kind of up to the north. And then also we have Santa Ana Pueblo and Zia Pueblo and Jemez, all heading up to the northwest. But also many of the people, especially maybe Hanisor ancestry, if they were working, if the men were working as shepherds for working for families who actually own the livestock, this kind of what's called today the East Mesa, this big sort of valley between the river and where Albuquerque and all these settlements are and the mountains, was prime grazing territory. So they were probably already familiar with this entire landscape and probably knew where the springs were and where the water was, if they had been managing sheep in this space. Which gets to sort of the next set of questions that I was looking at, which is why here? Why did they settle here specifically? I've already really talked about that first bullet point, which is land ownership would be the big reason, right? This is an opportunity to actually own land, which is really important. For many of these applicants, it would have been an opportunity to improve their livelihood, because otherwise they would mostly have been landless and dependent upon working for wealthier families. So it gave them the possibility of actually sort of growing their wealth and improving their own lives and securities for themselves and their families. I think it was familiar territory. I think they had largely been moving within this local environment and grazing sheep and maybe cattle sort of in that East Mesa area. So I think it was also sort of familiar to them. It had water. This is New Mexico. It's still a very arid region. And if you have crops to grow or livestock to raise or both, and they definitely had both, finding places with reliable sources of water is going to be paramount. Another thing that I think is important is that there were building materials available. So that initial survey that we did that identified the different components of the site, the historic Pueblo component, which would have been depopulated sometime before 1680. So nobody was living there. Nobody had been living there for a long time. But there were still evidence of those old rooms. You have all that stone, right? That if you're looking to build new homes and there's an old ruin of old room blocks nearby, I think that was a big factor too in why they chose to settle exactly where they did, because there was a lot of building material available to them. And also, even though being this close to the plains was really dangerous, it still presented opportunities for trade with the Comanches when they were open to trading, but also to different Apache groups, including the Carolina Apaches, that lived and moved through the kind of mountainous regions, and that could bring salt from like the salt flats to the south, and bison hides and elk and other things to trade. And we know that that's something that was important, because actually there's very few documented references to what happens in this community during its short lifespan. One of the things that happens is they get busted for illegal trade with the Carolina Apaches in 1765. Illegal because they didn't get a permit. But so that was certainly a factor. You might notice one of the things that's not on this slide is defense. They're living in this really dangerous mountain pass, and they've chosen to settle in this one specific place. And there's a lot of things in its favor, but it's not actually a very defensible location. And that's going to prove to be a problem. I think the reason that the Pueblos before them had occupied this place was actually to hide from the Spanish, who were down in the river valley. And so this is a great location if you want to see what's happening in the river valley without being seen by people living in the river valley. But it's not actually a great place if you're trying to hide from people coming from the other direction, from the east. So we also, because we don't know a whole lot about kind of those cost identities, what they mean in people's day-to-day lives, and we don't know anything about sort of the wives, the children, the servants of the few people who we have who are named as being granted lands in this settlement. The other thing that we do have is the material record, the artifacts left behind. And when we look at those artifacts, much like the UNM field school in the 1940s, mostly what we get is pottery. I'd say for our artifacts, it's about 75% pottery, about 24% animal bone, and 1% everything else. So we have a lot of pottery. New Mexico has a deep and strong tradition of pottery production. The local Pueblo Indian groups, many of them made pottery for millennia, but also were still making pottery at this time in the 1760s. Some of the Apache groups, the Jicarilla Apaches, also produced pottery. And then within these colonial settlements, especially as the Spanish colonists increasingly became very intermarried with and mixed in with the local indigenous populations, you also have pottery production happening in some of these Hispanic communities as well. So we have a lot of pottery to work with. I don't have any evidence at this site of pottery production actually happening here within the San Miguel site. But when we look at the kinds of pottery that we find, a lot of it is being made locally within that Middle Rio Grande area. So we have a lot of this kind of plain orange pottery with red decorated rims that is probably being made along the Rio Grande, possibly at Isleta Pueblo or in Hispanic communities in that area. We also have a lot of decorated pottery, this polychrome, like black and red and white or cream painted pottery. And a lot of that is actually coming from Santa Ana Pueblo, which is Isleta's to the south, Santa Ana Pueblo is to the north. It's north of Albuquerque, kind of near where Bernalillo is today. So let me see if I can come back to a map. Isleta is down here in the south. Santa Ana, the older Pueblo, is here, but that particular kind of pottery I'm showing you is from the Ranchitos village, which is right here on the river, close to Bernalillo, and was actually settled in 1760. So the timeline matches up pretty well. So that's interesting in that it does suggest that, we have that idea that a lot of the family names are coming from Varela, so close to Albuquerque, but we don't necessarily know about their wives or the servants. But even when we look in the pottery, a lot of it is coming from the same local area, a bit further, a bit more north to Bernalillo, and maybe some more connections with some of those pueblos around Bernalillo, including Santa Ana and then even Zio Pueblo further northwest. We have a little bit of pottery that's coming in from Zuni. So that might suggest more distant trade, or it might be telling us about people who are actually relocating during the 1760s, relocating from the far west to Sandia Pueblo in this area. We do get some imported material, which is actually surprising to me because the settlement is largely one from people who are pretty poor and pretty desperate. That we have, there's one tiny little fragment of East Asian porcelain that would have come over the Manila galleons into Acapulco and then into Mexico City and would have somehow made its way all the way up into New Mexico. You find fragments of porcelain in like Santa Fe at the Palace of the Governors, but I was surprised to find it here. We find Maiolica pottery, which is that tin glaze, what you might think of as like Talavera pottery. It's this example on the north, or the top end of this left photo is one of those. We even have some pottery that I'm pretty sure, although I need to work with some colleagues on this one here in the middle, it has painted decoration and a lead glaze and really sweet smelling clay. It's not a New Mexican pottery type. I'm pretty sure this is coming from sort of the Tonalá region of Western Mexico, so sort of near Guadalajara, which is interesting too. And that's suggesting that at least some of the people who are living here, either themselves or more likely their ancestors, their parents, their grandparents, had come from central Mexico, had brought some of these materials with them, and that they still have some of this pottery up until the point where they broke it and left the fragments behind. Okay, so that's the kind of who and why. So mostly what I want to talk to you guys about is the what. So what were they doing? And we've learned a few things based on sort of all of the work we've done at the site, but then also working sort of with the materials we've recovered from the site. One of these I actually wanted to highlight because this is from a thesis that was just written and completed by Gabe Field, who's a master's student at NMSU. He just graduated in May, who was looking at sort of the organization of the site itself. So we call them plaza settlements because these land grant communities were ordered by colonial authorities to settle in these fortified plazas that should look something like this illustration on the left, which is a sort of an outlined version of the Plaza del Cerro around Chimayo in northern New Mexico, which is often given as an example of like a nice kind of fortified enclosed plaza where you have rooms organized in like these room blocks with no gaps between, going entirely around the plaza with only a few open spaces where you would be able to drive in wagons. And usually those open spaces would be things that could have gates, right? And so the idea from the colonial authorities was that in order to be really good as sort of buffer settlements, in order to provide protection to the colony, these land grant communities should be building these fortified plazas so that they can withstand an attack and be better able to sort of defend the colony. What we actually usually find when we look at not only the archaeological sites that date to this time period, but also colonial documents complaining about these settlements is that they don't want to. They don't really want to live in these fortified settlements unless they have to. They'd rather live closer to their animals and to their agricultural fields in these isolated sort of rancho type settlements. And it also makes a certain amount of strategic sense. If you're living in your own little rural ranch and you get attacked, that's going to be tough luck for you. But on the other hand, like most of the other families are probably going to be okay, right? Because if all the houses are spread out, the attacks are probably going to be, as opposed to being able to like attack everybody where all of the stuff is in this one fortified plaza, you don't have a really sort of high value target like that to attack when they're sort of isolated in these different ranchos. So what we think about this site now, there's two things. One is that based on the size of the site that we've recorded, that plaza site at San Miguel, it's pretty small. We don't think it could have possibly been large enough to accommodate all of the people who are granted lands in this land grant settlement. And also when we look at other settlements from the same time period, they're often similarly small, but there's usually multiple plazas and then scattered ranchos, the little isolated rural homes kind of all around. So that some people are probably living close to their fields, others might be living in these plazas, or they might be doing both. They might be living in their sort of rancho and then retreating into a plaza when things get really dicey. So we think it's not the only settlement, but also we're not confident, or I'm not confident, that it was ever fully enclosed the way that colonial authorities wanted it to be. So this is a shaded relief map from some drone survey of the site. So you can see that south room block really clearly here. Here's the west block of rooms. We've excavated some rooms up here. There's a room right there. There's a room right there. One of the things that's really tricky, because there's these big gaps here on the east and here on the north. One thing that's tricky in being able to prove whether or not they ever fully enclose this plaza is that you might notice this area looks very flat and there's a big pile of dirt right here. It's been bladed far more recently. So there's a lot of road construction. I-40 is just a bit to the north. We have a frontage road cutting through here. There's a drainage, an arroyo that is a natural arroyo right over here. One of the things that was happening is people were dumping trash in the arroyo. And so to stop that, there was actually some blading work done to try to create a blockade along the road. And so it excavated down to bedrock, whatever remnants might have been over here. So it's possible that there were rooms up here that were just bladed away. I kind of don't think there were, but it is entirely possible because it's bladed. The other gap we have here is in the north, and here we have a different problem, which is there's a lot of big boulders on this site, partially from the mountains, but also from that highway construction. They dynamited out passages, which blew these giant granite boulders all across the site. And then the highway department came, and this is their right of way up here, and they didn't want those boulders on their side, so they pushed them all south of the fence. And so there's this huge row of just gigantic boulders all along here. So one possibility is that there may be some preserved rooms, but to access them, we have to figure out how to deal with these giant boulders. Okay. So big picture though, I think rather than forming the one fortified plaza as they were ordered to do, I think they probably had several different plazas and a bunch of ranchos, and that this is just one of them. I'm also not confident that they ever completely enclosed this plaza. But I do have reason to think that they didn't feel safe here, that the threat posed by being sort of surrounded by mountains with kind of the plains on the other side and not very able to see very far to see who's approaching, was a real issue. And one of the ways that I know that, or that I think I've learned that, is from looking at the animal bone. So there's very little evidence at this site in the faunal remains of hunting, which is strange because it was certainly an important thing in this community by the 1800s. They're surrounded by mountains. There's deer all in those mountains. If you get high enough up, there's elk. And that was always a really important resource to the earlier Pueblo communities, but also to later Hispanic communities. They weren't hunting them though, and instead what we see in the animal bone is really heavy reliance on their own livestock. So there's a lot of sheep bone, goat bone, cattle bone, and yes, they were raising those animals, but also those were their livelihood. And usually the preference is to try to actually grow the herds rather than to eat much of their own stock if they can. So I think the reason they weren't leaving to hunt and that they were relying more on their livestock is that they were actually scared to go pretty far from home. And we do have some documented records indicating that as well. The only other time besides the illegal trade that this site is mentioned in any colonial records is in 1768. A few of the Genízaros who live in Carnaway, in San Miguel de Carnaway, are accused of and then charged with cattle rustling. In one case, a few people were actually stealing cattle that belonged to Zia Pueblo and butchering them and selling the meat. But in another case, one of the individuals said that he was traveling between sort of Carnaway and Albuquerque, like on the mesa, and came across the cow, and that yes, he killed it and butchered it. And the reason he did it is because they weren't able to leave to hunt. It was really dangerous and his family was starving. And so it seems to have been a hazardous place to live, so hazardous that they were largely limiting their movements at this site. So if they went anywhere, they were going to be going west, closer to Albuquerque. They weren't leaving and going in the mountains for hunting. We have some other evidence of the maintenance of livestock within the site that kind of seems to connect with that. So this is an excavation in one of these, what looked like a room block on the west side of the plaza. But this particular room, when we excavated down to the floor, it was a pretty shallow and even floor. It had a thin layer of manure on it. They had also modified some of the naturally occurring boulders, like this one right here. They had chipped back away to make it one of the walls. So this is actually being used as an animal pen and not a sort of home, an occupation. So, and most likely, given the size, probably for sheep and goats that are being kept, possibly as a lambing pen, but they're definitely keeping animals in there. There's also indication in at least one of the units that we placed that continued into the plaza. There's evidence of corral walls so that they probably had animal pens also within the plaza. And this wasn't obvious from the surface. This was totally, the rock is enormous. You can see it right here, but it was totally underground. So we didn't see it until we started excavating and didn't really expect to find it there. Another thing that's a curiosity that I'll bring up just because there's some of the other oddness that'll come up later. So this right here, this is the exterior wall of a house. So the interior here, they had a nice adobe floor. A family was living over here. This is the inside of their house. This like little feature that's kind of ashy and has some charcoal over here is the place where they were seemingly dumping out the contents of their fireplace, right? It had a lot of charcoal and some broken pottery and other odds and ends. And then we have this corral feature right here. These two walls, the house wall and the corral wall, were joints. So you have overlapping layers of rock connecting the two. And right near the base of the wall, between those rock elements, were some large fragments from what would have been one sheep skull, which is interesting. There's some animal burrowing around the side, so there could be some disturbance causing that, but we weren't finding any other smaller or different bones in there. They were pretty large, and they were very much within the wall between rocks and not in those burrows. So it looked a little bit like an intentional deposit, like a foundation deposit that was placed there when they constructed those walls. Just strange. So now I wanted to go through some examples of domestic life. So the rooms that we tested, one was definitely an animal pen. One of them was where that corral wall was, but the interior space was really torn up by rodent burrowing. So it was definitely like people lived in that home, but we didn't get a nice clean floor surface. But one of the rooms that we tested had a really well-preserved interior floor. And it's actually, there's two rooms right here, and the units I'm going to show you are going to be in this sort of further room right on that side. So this is that excavation unit. It's not the entire room. We did a 2x2 meter test unit there, but we managed to come down on, this is adobe floor. So it's a prepared adobe floor. They're preparing and evening out the dirt floor. It has this nice corner fireplace that's been built into the room, that's something that is introduced into New Mexico with Spanish colonization. It's a Mediterranean style of architecture, those corner fireplaces. And so we see that this is a smaller version. Like, you get larger versions that are more often used in sort of larger interior, sort of like cooking contexts, but this is more likely to be something that would be maybe used for some cooking, but also probably used for heating up sleeping quarters as well. And so it has this nice adobe floor. We have this nice fireplace. This is actually collapsing wall from the wall that would have been further over. There's some deposits of ash connected with the fireplace, but also some evidence of plaster that had crumbled onto the floor. And then, so we have some interesting things. I just thought, first, in case this in Texas, you've probably seen plenty of corner fireplaces, but in case you haven't, this is from a kind of living history museum closer to Santa Fe. It's an example of a corner fireplace similar to this one that's actually built within a room. So it's not built actually into a corner of a room. They've just kind of built this little wall, half wall, into the room space and then constructed the fireplace up against it. We also have, this is going to be a little bit confusing because I should have included a photograph from the other direction, but so the profile that is underneath this wall, when we map the unit profile, you're looking at, here's those rock foundation elements from the wall. Here is the actual wall for the fireplace, this one right here. And one of the things that's interesting about this is that while that little wall that the corner fireplace is built against is built on their adobe floor, the actual wall foundations for their kind of what would have been the front of the house as it faces the plaza, that wall foundation is about 10, sometimes 5, but usually closer to 10 centimeters above their floor. So they were actually digging down into the room and preparing a floor that is, you would actually, when you walked into the house, you'd be stepping down to get to the floor. Like, the wall foundations were higher up, which is interesting and weird. I don't know why. My favorite artifact from this site is actually this one was sitting right here on the fireplace. It looked like it was being used as basically a fire dog, right? Like, you have usually, 3, maybe more stones that you would keep in a fireplace for if you were going to rest a pot on them, so that you're kind of elevating it up off the fire a little bit. And it had definite charring on the top. It had burned. But when we flipped it over, because it looked like it might be maybe a mono or something, it's an abrader. So there's this nice kind of path from a brader used to usually to straighten the arrow shaft for bows and arrows. But also somebody had carved with what looks like a metal tool, had carved these little lines into it. And it's a foot. So there's a big toe and then 4 little toes. So it is a little a braider slash foot effigy slash fire dog. I like to imagine that they used it, that they would heat it up in the fireplace and then put it in the bottom of the bed as a foot warmer. But I don't know how it was being used, and why they carved toes in it, but I know that they did. There's also the possibility so that a braider might have come from the earlier Pueblo settlement, but one of the things that's important to know about this land grant community in the 1760s is that they were very unlikely to have any guns. Most of the people who lived there were probably armed with bow and arrow and spear. And so this actually may have been created, or certainly may have been still used by the people who lived in this home, not just as a fire dog, but they might have also been using it as an abrader still. And just to give you a sense of the kinds of artifacts we find, metal during the colonial period, especially in New Mexico, because everything was supposed to come from Spain, right? Be imported from Spain, but it had to come overland all the way up through Chihuahua, and then this long, difficult overland path all the way up to New Mexico. You don't get a lot of metal coming into New Mexico, and everything that does come in is used within an inch of its life. So we only found a handful of metal artifacts the entire season. The most intact of them is this, looks like nail turned into a hook that was sitting on one of the room floors. There's also this very nice copper crossbow bolt on the top, but that's almost certainly not from this land grant component. It's probably from the Coronado expedition, and probably was here in some connection to either them traveling through the canyon or maybe the earlier Pueblo. So some other cool things to add that I didn't know when I was last talking about this site, Peter Kovacic, now Dr. Peter Kovacic, has just defended his PhD at Boston University. He collected plant remains from the excavations we did in 2022. And so now we actually know some other new things about the site. One of them is what they're using as firewood, because he analyzed all of the charcoal. And so that unit that I've been showing you, we're very much in New Mexico. We're in sort of the elevation that has a lot of pinyon and juniper, the PJ area, and they're definitely using pinyon and juniper, but they're also using a lot of scrub oak, especially in these units, this top set of units that are within that room block, which suggests they might be specifically gathering scrub oak either for kindling because they have more small bits, easier to catch fire, but also probably because it's not as smoky than the juniper, or especially pinon. Pinon is pretty smoky. Whereas we see different choices in other places. So there's more like heavily juniper around what we think is actually sort of an orno and oven feature in the plaza. So they seem to prefer to use juniper for that. We have pinon primarily being used in another probably cooking feature, like I think it was probably where they were doing like cooking meat in a pit that was elsewhere on the plaza. And so we're getting some insight into fuel wood selection, which I think is actually really interesting, because that's another thing that would have driven the people who lived here to need to go collecting firewood, especially kids, usually to go collecting firewood sort of in and around the community. So getting a sense of how far they're willing to go and what they're choosing is interesting. We also have a sense of the domesticated crops. So that unit that all those pictures from that unit, we have maize and chili seeds being recovered there. In the one that has the corral, we also have, in addition to those, some squash and wheat. And then we have maize, wheat, and chili all close to this burn feature in the southwest that we think might be an outdoor oven or an orno. And that actually, I wasn't entirely certain whether I was wanting it to be an orno and I wasn't sure. And knowing that all of those plants are popping up there, that actually makes it more likely, because those are all things I would expect them to be cooking in an outdoor oven. So kind of closing comments and then acknowledgements. How does it end? So this is a short-lived settlement, right? They're established here. The first people who come and are granted lands here are given those lands in February of 1763. They're attacked in October of 1770. So this is about 7.5 years that they're here. One question we had when we initially did the survey was, did it burn? And the reason we were wondering that is because there was a lot of very, very burned adobe mortar along that south room block that had been excavated by UNM. And a lot of the artifacts that UNM recovered in those excavations are very burned. Thing is, probably not. I'm not sure still what's going on, and I don't know that I'll ever be able to answer what was going on with those UNM excavations, because of course they did completely excavate those rooms, so it's hard to know unless I can find their field notes or photographs. It's going to be really hard to figure out what they found in those rooms. But in all of the rooms we tested in 2022, there was no roofing material. Nothing was left sitting above the floors. That suggests that they pulled any roofing material to reuse when they were ordered to destroy their homes. And so we don't have any indication that the houses were burned in that attack in October of 1770. And if they were, not all of them were. It would have been probably just the ones in the south. There are some indications, though, that they probably left in a hurry. So one of the things that we did find in this unit was half of one of those broken red on buff bowls just sitting on the floor. There wasn't, they hadn't clean swept, but there wasn't much on the ground. It wasn't like they'd been using it to throw trash in. The floor surfaces were pretty clean. So something like this probably broke towards the end, and there was no reason to take it with them. The last few things that we found, so we've got some weird things that are kind of my mysteries going forward. So the same unit, you're gonna get real sick of the picture of this unit, but it was so nice and intact. We left this last portion of the unit because it had wall fall that was continuing past the unit walls, and we didn't want to collapse it until the end, and until we were absolutely positive that that it wasn't an architectural feature. And so towards the end, once we got everything else done, we went back and we actually removed all these rock elements so we could get down to the floor and document those sides. And when we removed these rocks, this wall fall right here, right underneath them, sitting on that floor, right next to the fireplace, was this guy. This is not a person, this is a cow. The remnants of a cow. It's a juvenile, so not a calf, but not fully adult. And the skull was actually sitting directly on the room floor, sort of top of the skull down on the floor. And it was very, very well preserved when we got to it. Like even the sort of tiny cranial fragments that usually if a cow skull is left on the ground, they shatter, they break, they blow away. Everything was still intact when we first found it. So what that tells me is that this cow head, and we didn't find the rest of the cow, we found the skull. That this cow head is placed on the ground or left on the ground of this room, and then the walls are collapsed on top of it after the roofing material has been removed, probably to reuse it. So this could all be happening when they were ordered to go back and destroy their homes in May of 1771. But that they left this cow there, the walls are collapsed on top of it and bury it fast enough that it doesn't break down. It's not exposed to the elements. That's what the sort of stratigraphy and the preservation suggest happened here. Why that happened, why they would have a cow head, place it on the ground and collapse the walls on top of it, I have no idea. And it gets weirder. So when we look at those collections from 1946 from UNM, like I said, one of our major issues is we don't have any of their records. There's no report, there's no photographs from the actual project, there's no map. There are the bulk collections, the artifact collections, and those artifacts, many of them, especially the bulk materials, come with the original bag tags from the excavation. So they'll say the names of the students who were working, they have the site name, and they have what looks like a quadrant system. They're usually things that I'll say like A4 or C2. Sometimes they don't usually record a level. Sometimes they'll say floor or they'll say fill. Based on, the excavation was by Paul Reeder, who was a professor at UNM at the time, based on earlier projects he did and other projects sort of in this part of New Mexico that were being done in the 30s and 40s. I think there was a grid that was being laid out around the plaza. And I think they were numbering the grid, sort of, there were numerals kind of going, for whatever reason, east to west, and letters going from south to north. I'm guessing it was probably 20 feet by 20 feet. I know they were recording in feet and inches, and they do triangulate some positions, and there's numbers. Some of those numbers get to like 17 or 18. So that suggests to me we might be talking about a 20 by 20 foot grid. So that's what I've hypothesized. And I made a grid. And then I placed it over my site map. And then we were looking at where the artifacts were coming within those squares. So all of these red stars are units that produce more than 100 sherds. This doesn't entirely make sense to me. If they have more than 100 sherds, I'm expecting that to be a room or an occupation, unless it's a midden. And so in the south, these line up really well with those A units. A little hard to tell what's happening here on the east side. But I am actually fairly certain about one of these. So this woman, her name is Charlotte Toll, who's being pictured here in 1946 as a field school student, sweeping out this excavation unit. I looked to see where her name was on any bag tags. She only worked in unit A4. So where she's sweeping, which is in the south room block, should be this room right here. So with that as the background, one of the things we found in going through those artifacts is, of the animal bones especially, there were other units that contained cow skulls, 2 of them with these green stars right here. There was also one house that contained a mostly complete horse skull, almost certainly sitting on or very near the floor, and that's this unit right here. And that's really strange because it's hard enough to understand why there would be a house skull, or a cow skull left on the floor of a room. I got nothing for a horse skull. And then we also have a Kona shell, which is a marine seashell that is left on the floor. And the tag actually says left on the floor of one of the rooms. So there seems to be something that's happening that's connected with the closure of these rooms when they were abandoned or when they returned and were ordered to destroy their homes. That I've never seen anywhere in a different Spanish colonial context, but because these people included many Genízaros and Coyotes, there's also the possibility that this is connecting with cultural ideas that could belong to any number of different indigenous groups from this area too. And so that's something that I am continuing to explore going forward. And that is mostly what I have. I did want to acknowledge that this whole project, as it's been going on from the beginning, has been a collaboration. I was invited to start this research project by Moises Gonzalez, who's here, who at the time was the president of the Canyon de Carnoy land grant community. So there's still a land grant community today. They actually trace themselves to the second time those lands were granted in 1819. But consider this particular site to be like the old village site and an important part of their heritage. So we've been working with them and also with the City of Albuquerque's Open Space Division, who manages their parks and open spaces and trails. They acquired this property in 2021. And so they've been working with the land grant with us on these projects. We've also been working with the Maxwell Museum at the University of New Mexico to work on those existing collections from 1946 with Statistical Research Incorporated, which is a contract firm with an office in Albuquerque who's helped with some of the mapping, including some geophysical mapping, remote sensing of the site. And of course, with lots of students. So we have 2 field schools who've been here. I'm going to be taking them out there again next summer. And a lot of students who've done master's theses and most recently Peter's PhD dissertation using data collected from this site. So that is everything. And I'll stop talking and see if anyone's got questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kelly. I'll open it out to, has anybody got any questions for Kelly? Very good presentation. Thank you.
There's nothing in the chat right now, but I'll start it off. Kelly, were the land grant settlements, did they develop them in conjunction with a nearby mission slant presidio? Is that how this worked out? Or was there a presidio anywhere within shouting distance of these settlements, or were they basically on their own out there like you were talking about?
No, they were mostly on their own. So the missions are mostly established among the pueblos in the early colonial period. So those are where there are missions. That's kind of in the pueblo communities. But in the late colonial period, you have a much larger sort of secular colonial population. Like the colonial population is growing. The only presidio really is based, and they move if they're being sent to deal with different issues, but they're based around Santa Fe. And so they don't actually have a very large kind of military force. And that's part of their issue is they have this growing colonial population. They have a lot of lands, but they're also surrounded by far more mobile, the Apache, the Navajo Utes, Comanches increasingly in the 1700s who are kicking their butts. Kiowas, like they can't actually really defend themselves against those groups. And so this is one of their strategies for doing it, was actually to basically offer rights to land, signed by the colonial governor to people desperate enough to take them up on it, in exchange for they then have to defend it. They have to be sort of the buffer settlement. They have to defend those or repel those attacks.
I'm not an expert on Spanish missions or anything in Texas. Do I assume there were two different governors, right? One for the New Mexico area and one for Texas. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's the colony of New Mexico is earlier than the colony. I mean, New Spain claimed the area that was Texas, but they weren't actually sort of actively establishing a colonial presence in Texas until a little bit later. So New Mexico is weirdly
Right.
early for the Southwest, and then it's established as a colony officially in 1598, which is pretty early. And it's its own colonial province with its own governor. And Texas comes in later and has a different governor. And so it's kind of funny in the colonial history where you see some of the divisions between, especially given that I live in Cruces, which is like by the border of all three, you see some of these divisions between New Mexico and Texas, and then what is now Chihuahua, kind of developing in the colonial period with the way that they're being administered by the colonies, having different governors, but also the way that they're being sort of played off each other. So you have like in the late 1700s, early 1800s, like a lot of the New Mexicans are trading pretty heavily with the Comanches for cattle that have been stolen from Texas, which the Texans are not happy
Sounds
about.
right.
And you also get like, groups that are taking captives taken in New Mexico that are being sold into Texas. So you see some of those rivalries kick up really early, which is interesting.
While you were talking, I was Googling up land grant settlements and fortified land grant settlements in Texas, and it really didn't give it per se. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that was kicking back on Google on down along the Rio Grande,
Yeah.
but our experience with it, at Texas Archaeological Society Field School in 2016 and 17, I believe it was, we were out north of Uvalde at Mission San Lorenzo up there. They had previously been up at San Saba, up at Menard. Of course, all the missions around San Antonio. We at HAS were, a couple of historians had us looking for a proposed mission that never actually happened in Harrison, Waller County here in the Houston area, where a bunch of natural springs were. And it's all in the same time period as your guys, 1750s to 1770s. The mission north of Uvalde, I think it opened up in 17, correct me if I'm wrong on this, Jeff, 1762, and it closed like 9 years later, about 1771. The one that we were looking at here in Harris County, I believe, Bob, wasn't that about the same time period, about 1750? And then they got a new governor in around 1760, and he said, no, we're not going to make it, and all that other stuff.
In theory, it was.
So it seems like down in Mexico City, they were making the decisions. We're going to do this up there in the Northlands to push the Indians out. And of course, they had different ways of going about it, but money was always an issue, it seemed like also. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and the land grant thing, so it's confusing. My sense of it from New Mexico, but also working in Arizona and some with like the colonial Texas history too. From Mexico City, the northern territories were to them what the land grant was to New Mexico, like the Carnway land grant was to New Mexico, which is it's a buffer. They were primarily concerned about keeping the French and the English and later the Americans out of the silver mining territories that were producing a lot of wealth. Yeah.
Yeah. Texas.
And yeah, exactly. So like their concern was like Zacatecas and South. And so your Texas, New Mexico, like Arizona, California, like they cared about them to the extent in the late 1700s, they actually, that's part of the Bourbon reforms, they try to like reorganize the defenses of the northern frontier, but not really to protect or invest in those colonies so much as to like maintain those colonies as the buffer to keep the French and the English and the Americas out of Zacatecas. So yeah, there's less investment in sort of the security of the area, and there's a lot that you know people propose, but that doesn't actually happen. With the land grants, there are different ways of doing land grants within the Spanish colonial system. The most common is that somebody who's wealthy can apply for a grant of lands for livestock, right? So those grants are made usually to an individual, and so you'll see a lot of you know, it'll be like the Lucero grant or the Lopez grant, where if they date to colonial times, they were granted to an individual for their family for raising livestock, and so that's kind of personal wealth. These community land grants were much less common and are they're not unique to New Mexico, but like this particular form of them sort of is where you get a lot of that happening, especially the sort of 1740s to 1790s. And then sometimes continuing, it actually continued into the 1800s and into the Mexican period in New Mexico, where they would issue these grants of land also to a group of applicants with the idea that they establish like self-governing communities. And so they're different because they're, you know, people are getting their individual lands and they're getting their agricultural lands, but then there's also all this land that's essentially corporate property. It's called the ejido. And so they're supposed to, like, the surrounding mesas and the river waters and the mountains, like all of that where they get their firewood and where they do their hunting and where they graze their animals, isn't actually owned by a specific family. It's held in common by members of that land grant. And it's been in New Mexico, part of the like one consequence of that has been those kind of land rights were understood and maintained through the Mexican period. And then with kind of the Mexican-American War, American conquest, it's gotten stickier because there were questions about, like, the US didn't really kind of have that same understanding of corporate land holdings.
Right.
And so they were trying to like confirm title to individual families, but then weren't sure what to do about those common lands. So in some cases they were maintained, but in a lot of cases they weren't, especially when there's a lot of land speculation. So like with like the Cañón de Carnoy land grant, the 1819 land grant, which is a community that's still there, that initial land grant was about 90,000 acres. What got confirmed to them was about 2,000 acres. And so one of those consequences for those communities is like those common lands were needed because you can't make a living on farming alone here. You're doing sort of farming in the river valley, but then maintaining livestock up in the mountains and on the mesas. And so you need that land to be able to make a living, to make that work. And when they lose access to those common lands, a lot of people can't afford to live there anymore. So it's driven a lot of the population into that were people who had lived on these land grants for decades or even centuries, that got kind of forced out and into the military, into agricultural labor, other things, and sort of spread all across the country because they couldn't make a living.
So
It's
is there any evidence that anybody stayed for a while after the majority left and the
No.
structures were turned down, were torn down?
Yeah.
No? Everybody left
There's
en masse.
Yeah, it really does, because that was one of the things with the initial survey is, you know, did anybody stick around or did anybody come back a little bit earlier? Because the lands are kind of after there's a Comanche Peace Treaty in 1786 that settles things down a bit, and particularly by the 18 teens, things had kind of calmed down quite a bit with the Apaches as well, at least for a time. And so the lands are actually, people are applying again in the early 1800s, and in 1819 the lands are granted again. And so then you do have people coming back, and they do the sort of community of San Miguel is what is today Carnoel, which is kind of when you drive through I-40 through that mountain pass, you're actually driving through Carnoel, like it's still there, but they resettled a little bit further east of where this site is, probably in a place that gave them a better view of the surroundings, and then had a second settlement that was north of where Tijeras is today. But there was no indication for this particular site. There's no indication that anybody lived there after 1771. There's a wagon road that cut through. There was a later railroad, but nobody seems to have lived there again.
So, what happens to the land grants when this type of thing happens? Does it revert back to the governor,
Yeah.
the colonial government,
Yeah. So
and
that
the
and that
people
was
who
part
used
of
to live there have no more business with it at all?
yeah.
Okay,
That's
yeah.
when they and that's so when they fled in 1770, the colonial the governor especially really wanted somebody to occupy that mountain pass, and so they were trying to get them. He was ordering his alcalde in Albuquerque, get them back out there, get them to go resettle. They need to, after the winter when they could have gone back in to sort of plant for spring. He was trying to get them to go back. And when they were seeming reluctant because they were scared, they thought it was too dangerous.
Hmm.
He was actually sending his alcalde to recruit other people, other Genízaro people from around Bernalillo, round them up for an information meeting to try to sell them this exciting new opportunity.
You got to take this.
Yeah. And there were no takers. People who were yeah, land sounds great. I don't have any. And nobody was persuaded. And so that was the part of sending them back out there to destroy their homes, was that if you don't reoccupy, I'm going to you're going to destroy these homes. You have forfeited your claim to this land. So that it reverts to the crown. And so when it's granted again in 1819, it's got the same name, it's the same basic area, but it's a different land grant. There were some of the same people, some of the families who had been part of that initial land grant, their kids essentially are part of that second land grant, but it in that interim, nobody, they lost the claim.
I would imagine some people might be asking for some soldiers.
Yeah, or guns. I mean, that's the other thing.
Some
Really,
defense.
they were always talking about in these records that was supposed to be if you're applying for a land grant, you have to show you can defend it. So they wanted them to build a plaza and they wanted them to have guns, but it's not like they were supplying them the guns. And
No, of course not.
Of all the colonies at this point, and New Mexico is sort of the tail ends, they're very poorly armed because, again, weapons, like everything else, have to come all the way up. And they not only are there fewer available, but also they're getting marked up as they make it further north. So they don't have much. And in this time period, in the 1700s, the French have better guns than the Spanish, and the English have better guns than the French. And those are things that are making their way to the Comanches. So the Comanches have more and better arms, mostly by this point, than anybody in New Mexico does. So they're
right.
way outclassed.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
Nice talk there, Kelly. Did you have any prehistoric artifacts? I mean, that's a nice strategic location. Were you down to bedrock, or do you find things earlier than the Spanish occupation?
We find things earlier than the Spanish occupation. The biggest thing that's earlier than the Spanish occupation is Pueblo, but it's not actually prehistoric. It's an occupation that's not documented, but that, based on the pottery they have, dates sometime between the sort of 1500s and 1680. So it probably actually it could be a Pueblo that settles there as basically refugees from the Coronado expedition, because there's a war with the southern Tiwa Pueblos, who are kind of the ones who live near Albuquerque, that happens in 1540, and I think they fled. Well, they're known to have retreated into the mountains, and I think this might be one of those communities, at least in part. There's earlier material that we found in survey, black on white painted pottery, that would, in this area, probably dates to the 11 and 1200s, so ancestral Pueblo occupations. And there's one of the questions, were there any lithics? There's flakestone, including some corner notched arrow points and some real pretty bifaces. Probably a lot of that stuff is either ancestral Pueblo or historic Pueblo, but because the people in the land grant are still using largely bow and arrow technology, it's really hard to, unless you have a very diagnostic point type, it's hard to identify when it's being used. And because this is a canyon, we don't really get deeply stratified. There's the deepest levels I've gone to still have stuff from the colonial period within the plaza. And
Okay,
there's a
thanks.
lot of active erosion. So a lot of these sediments also get kind of mixed together. But there's some lovely Alabates chert, because the Alabates quarry is pretty much due east. And so I don't know if that stuff is from the ancestral Pueblo or the historic Pueblo period or later, but there's some beautiful Alabates bifaces in there.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask one more question, Bob? I know we probably want to
Well,
turn
we've
this
got
down.
a couple still sitting in the chat.
Okay. Oh, we do. Okay, I didn't see those. Let me read those first. Hold on. Hold on.
I think we've already answered Gary Hartman's, which was
Yeah,
Jeff.
we got the lithics question. Do you think the abandonment had anything to do with the great exodus from the area of the southwestern peoples? Was asked.
Not of this one. So the Southwest is known historically and prehistorically for having a lot of migrations. It's a tough climate, right, with periodic pretty extreme droughts. And so you have a lot of migrations in different time periods. Like, I mean, obviously with Chaco up to sort of the Mesa Verde area, from the Mesa Verde area down towards actually Santa Ana, Zia, Carish, Pueblo, so like down to the Rio Grande. You have something causing some major population reorganization probably around the 1400s in southern New Mexico. But this is happening later. This is the colonies are still very much occupied. The late colonial period, it runs sort of 1692 to 1821 in New Mexico. And the colonial population is just growing throughout. So you're not seeing sort of a widespread abandonment, but definitely during the 1740s, 50s, and 60s, and 70s, like the middle 1700s, the people who are adjacent to especially the Southern Plains, but also on the Colorado Plateau, because the horses have spread out onto the plains, right? Like that's one of the consequences of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 is the Spanish had a lot of the horses. When the revolt happens and the Spanish are either killed or flee, and a lot of the survivors flee south to El Paso, they leave behind a lot of their livestock. The horses are then taken up very quickly on the Southern Plains. So you have, by the time the like 1710 French colonists encountering the Caddo on the eastern side of the plains, they already have horses to trade. They're managing their own herds. So the threat posed by increasingly mobile groups around the Rio Grande Valley has gotten much higher. So it's the abandonment of this site really has to do with it's just a very dangerous time for underarmed colonists to be living anywhere near the plains.
Which the next question we had was, do we know what scared them so bad that after living there 7 years, they refused to come back? I think you just answered that. So
yeah, although one of the frustrating things is we don't actually have, so we know they were attacked. There's some indications, although I don't know how much I trust them, that they might have been attacked by Gila Apaches, Gileños. But there's no specific descriptions of the attack. The records that we have are them refusing to go back and saying it's too dangerous. But so I don't know, like I think people were probably killed in the attack, but we don't actually know that. And we don't have any specifics of like, did they burn the settlements? Did they kill 15 people? Did they kill one person? That's another reason why like looking at the site and looking for evidence of burning and other things has been interesting. Is we know they were attacked, we know they were really scared, but we don't actually know what happened in that attack.
okay.
Unless we've got any more questions, that was a very interesting talk, Kelly. Thank you very
Kelly.
much for coming.
Thanks.
Well, thank you very much
Thank you, Kelly.
for giving it to us. That's great. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for letting me talk. I'm excited always to talk about this site, probably in a monotonous amount of detail. So.
Okay. We'll talk to you again, no doubt, in due course. Okay. So I'd like to just wish everyone a very pleasant evening.
Hi, Heather.
I think we're done.
Okay, guys. Everybody
Bye-bye.
take care.
Bye.
We'll see you soon. We'll see you in August, Heather. All right, everybody take care. Good night.
Bye.